Hello, this is Mike Sapien, Chief Analyst from OVM, and today we're going to have a session sponsored by Tata Communications, and the speaker with me today is Peter Quinlan. Please go ahead, Peter.
Hi, Mike, and thanks for the opportunity to chat. By way of introduction, I head Tata Communications Business Collaboration Portfolio. I'm based out of Singapore with global responsibility for services including our global SIP trunking, as well as collaboration services based on Microsoft and Cisco technologies, and our hosted contact center solution.
And today we're going to discuss, have a discussion about voice business, and we've titled this Isn't Voice Business Dead? With the thought that we have seen the voice business go through many transitions. We've seen it go up and down, and today we'll talk a little bit about what we have seen in global voice services and the new demand that's coming from different providers. And with that, I start with a few questions and let Peter respond to various thoughts on this topic about global voice businesses. And one of the initial questions is all about this idea that the voice business has been pretty slow and seems to be dying, but from the talk of most providers today, there doesn't seem to be the priority and or the high demand that they used to see. But Peter, what is Tata Communications seeing that has proven this differently?
It's a good question, Mike, and I like to joke about it with my guys that the demise of voice has been greatly exaggerated. And there's no doubt that it has shrunk considerably and given rise to those sort of sentiments. Both the volumes that are running over traditional voice services as well as the price per minute. But I guess the fact of the matter is people still use voice in their collaboration just as much as they used to, if not more, as we get into an increasingly connected and global economy. And I guess what we've seen is, although the traditional forms of voice and toll-based calling have declined, in their place, what you've seen sort of stabilizing the market, or at least giving rise to an uptick in demand and very exciting new applications, is the fact that people are using voice increasingly for conferencing, for various types of calling and collaboration applications, and also in all kinds of applications that are not traditionally thought of as collaboration applications. And here you might think of things like delivery companies or ride-hailing applications. All of these sorts of things generate voice minutes, and as people become increasingly dependent on their devices and their smartphones, voice will always remain a key piece of human interaction and collaboration, and you're just finding new ways to do that with new devices and new services.
That sounds interesting, Peter. Tell me a little bit more about how the voice business and your offer has changed and is different now, and maybe a little more color on this new demand and new players that you're seeing looking for the voice services that you're talking about.
Sure, and I guess if you think about it, our traditional voice service comprised of wholesale services like delivering long distance termination minutes to other service providers or providing global roaming services to other service providers. Tata did and still does do a lot on the wholesale side as a carrier's carrier, if you will. And I guess one of the major shifts was sort of how do people consume, and you've seen that in the enterprise space as organizations typically now take a much greater control over the way their voice is managed, and you'll see them using any form of a UC application, whether that's Microsoft Skype for Business or Microsoft Teams or Cisco Teams or any number of cloud-based collab providers. And so a lot of that voice that was traditionally, between offices or between campuses or between people in their homes, and that's all going the way of VoIP, and it's all on net, on the organization's network. The advantage of that, obviously, is a huge amount of cost is avoided. And from a service provider perspective, all that revenue goes away. But what you still have is that need for long-distance termination. So rather than be often selling that to other service providers, which we still do to a great extent, A lot of times we're just selling that to enterprises who buy a SIP trunking service from us and then leverage us to terminate the calls off net, if you will, into the PSTN, breaking out from their network wherever they need to. So you have to be smarter in the way that you deliver it, and you have to tailor that to an enterprise, but it's still very much generating demand. The other thing that you've seen is people still engaging in conferencing, and a lot of those conferencing minutes also move on net, but organizations and cloud service providers consume conferencing minutes, probably to a greater degree than they used to. Certainly people are doing more conferencing minutes than they used to, and revenue-wise and on a per-minute basis, that market continues to grow. And providing access numbers or toll-free and local dial-in numbers to conferencing, as well as callback services from a conferencing platform. Again, the customers now may be a cloud service provider or they may be an enterprise themselves, but we're still providing those services to facilitate conferencing, and that's happening to a much greater degree. And I guess the last category I'd mention is, a whole new category, which is, I guess, emerged in the age of digital customer experiences and smartphones, are all kinds of people looking at the way that they manage customer interaction in a smarter way, using combinations of technologies which, may have stemmed from a contact center, but very often stem simply from an app. And users like to be able to click and to message with an agent or to talk with an agent. They expect that agent to be a lot smarter and better informed about all their CRM data or all their background of the transactions that they've done with the company or what they're trying to do right now. And so they look to have that instantaneous ability to connect, sometimes over IP, but very often over a PSTN, via an app or via a website where they're interacting with their favorite vendor or their service provider, be it a delivery company or a travel agent or a ride-hailing application. You want to be able to deliver those sorts of voice interactions with quality, and because you're facilitating a transaction in which the voice is just a means to an end. It's not a voice service per se, but voice is critical to getting the job done. And so you see all sorts of applications generating voice traffic that did not historically do that before. And that, I think, those factors, as I say, you have to pivot and be a bit smarter about how you deliver and who your customer is. But the voice demand and the volume is still very much there.
Yeah, that is interesting what you're talking about. Maybe you can go a little bit into what unique features, what back office or go-to-market investments that Tata Communications has made to address this demand. You're hinting a lot about the global capability or global reach, but it sounds like you've had to do some work in the either back office and our go-to-market to meet this demand, as well as maybe add some unique features.
Sure. And I guess I'd summarize by saying our job is really to insulate or protect the end user, ultimately the customer, from the complexity that has historically been a telco world. And by that I mean, if you want to set up telephony services around the world, whether you're an enterprise or whether you're a ride-hailing application or a delivery company or an e-commerce company that needs deliveries, if you want to deliver telco services, you can either buy them from a traditional telco or you can try to do it yourself. And doing it, buying from a traditional telco, as I mentioned, it tends to be expensive and people are looking for ways to avoid it. Doing it yourself means that you have to understand a little bit about costs and how traffic gets routed and how to manage QoS, as well as the regulatory constraints in each and every market where you're going to do business or have your end user situated. And that can be a fairly daunting task, especially as the organization becomes increasingly reliant on collaboration, or for someone who's a cloud-based application, really the collaboration facilitates the core transaction that is the survival of the business. So this is all very important for people to be able to collaborate, but suddenly it's become very hard because although you've moved into this world where a lot of it's over IP, you haven't escaped from regulatory, you haven't escaped from the constraints of the PSTN, and you haven't escaped from the vagaries of how do you deliver a quality of service on a global basis. So we do all that as a traditional telco, and by sort of divorcing or insulating the customer from that complexity, what I mean is packaging services up so that users can get up and running or applications can be coded very quickly to the kind of services that are required. And all of those things are taken care of inherently in the service so that you can focus on your core business, whatever that may be. And we do that both by repackaging traditional services so that we can support enterprises and application service providers more effectively. And that may mean providing them more data on billing, usage, or parsing out data, but it also means delivering quality of service across the world in a way that they can consume, monitor, and manage. And it goes beyond that into things like, how do you do things like giving organizations the control and the flexibility and the monitoring and the management and the administration of the voice consumption? How do you turn up numbers for users quickly? How do you make sure that usage isn't getting out of hand? How do you protect against fraudulent usage? All of these are things that we do very well, and we insulate the customer by packaging the services in a way that allows for easy consumption in the manner in which they desire. At the enterprise end of the spectrum, that means services that are packaged and tailored for the enterprise and giving them the granularity, the flexibility, and the administration that they want. And as you get into the cloud application service provider, it's all of those things. But it's also one more thing, which is really an API layer that allows anybody with coding skill, obviously the cloud-based application providers fit that description, allows them to code to our systems and access the voice in a way that's easy for them as a software-based company, but get all the access to the traditional telco services on a global basis that they would need to, with the speed of digital, meaning allowing them to really code to a global telco infrastructure in a regulatory compliant way without having to become a telco themselves, if that makes sense.
No, that makes a lot of sense. From my years of covering both voice services and SIP trunking, trying to create a global platform to do what you just described can get very complex, and there's a lot of staffing and overhead that many companies may not want to approach. And just wondering, when you see a customer who tries to go it themselves or maybe uses a patchwork, a regional approach, what do you normally see as makes the difference that they reconsider and come to Tata Communications to kind of get a global offer? It definitely can be very complex. Just wonder what you've seen and what are the major pain points for those customers who do try to do it the other way.
I would say the major learning, I think, would be that it's always experience that drives the decision. And sometimes that can be the experience of the individual organization, or it could be the experience of people who have joined the organization and have tried to do it before. But, to be clear, a lot of organizations set out, and, it's easy to understand why. You've got a core business, it's running well. You might have a great cloud application, you're adding subscribers, you're growing transactions, all the right metrics are there. And you think, let's go add voice, or let's go extend our voice service or our service with voice into a market we've never done before, and suddenly a lot of things change. And it's hard to imagine why that would change, because a lot of these, growing up in a single market, very often where internet connectivity speeds, mobile coverage, all of those things are almost taken as a given in a lot of developed markets. Coming from those markets, as many organizations do, and trying to go global, if you will, or extend in the international markets, suddenly a lot of parameters change, which may previously have been taken for granted. So I guess the biggest teacher has been when organizations try it themselves. And what happens is you sort of reach a tipping point when you say, well, wait a minute. I mean, I've actually had enterprise CIOs say to me, at this point, my boss is asking me, why are we trying to become a telecommunications company? He was doing it himself. He was doing a reasonable job of it. I mean, nothing wrong with what he was doing, but it was the level of effort and the amount of work that you had to put into making all those odds and ends work reached a tipping point where he was, in this case, the guy said, look, we're a manufacturing company. This collaboration stuff is a means to an end, and it's critical to our business, but it's not our core competency, and it's not where we want to devote the resource. So that's even more true when you talk about a cloud application provider who's not in the collaboration business at all. I use the example of, anybody with an e-commerce site who wants to facilitate deliveries, and they would like to facilitate transactions where perhaps the person receiving the delivery and the delivery driver can communicate with voice and call one another back, but only for the duration of that transaction. What I've just described is pretty much what happens on any Uber ride or any delivery of a package at your house, right? And you want that to be able to happen, but nobody wants the other party to have their personal phone number after the transaction's over. Facilitating that in, say, 20 countries around the world in a way that's compliant with regulations and doesn't break the bank can be a daunting task. So what you find is people will try it in one country, try it in two, and at some point they reach a point where they say, look, this is just too hard. I want to focus on my core business. And then the conversation becomes very rich, because then they say, well, wait a minute, is there an easier way to do it? And the answer is obviously yes. With Tata Communications, you can effectively leverage a carrier with a tier 1 carrier grade global infrastructure, again, with a software API interface and with portal-based interfaces as well. If your development team is not where ready to consume via API, and do this in a very easy way, very quickly. And that's our endeavor, to make it simple so that you can get on with your core business and move ahead. But usually people will take a crack at it a few times before they say, well, wait a minute, let me just find someone who does this for a living, and I'll go let them do it. It's like my wife says whenever I start a project like fixing a sink, she's like, when are you going to call the contractor? It's not what you do well. So why don't you just let the guy who knows how to do it, and then we'll get on with the stuff that does matter to us more, and that we care about our core business, if you will.
Yeah, that is kind of a unique dynamic of trying to try this yourself, which does happen with a lot of large enterprises and some of these new players you're talking about. Just a comment, I guess I'd say, is that sometimes I see this tried, let's say, in one country like the U.S., and that seems so simple to do something like this in the U.S. only. And that probably is because there's a North American numbering plan, there's geographic coverage is pretty easy, and there's multiple providers that will appease this demand. But I do see that going beyond the U.S. or one country, it starts to get more complex, more cumbersome, and then you have regulations and the inbound, outbound, and how to treat VoIP traffic, et cetera, gets very complex. And so what I'd like to do here is maybe summarize what we've gone through a little bit and see if there's a little more here. But what you've gone through tells me the voice business is not dead, but it has morphed, and it's gone into a kind of another phase, that there is demand from many global ASPs and OTT players that needs to be addressed, and that Tata Communications has invested and developed a global solution for this demand, and that trying to piece this together either on your own or with some regional providers will not be easy or pain-free for most customers. Did I miss anything, Peter?
No, I think that's a very good summary, and I guess the only point that I would add is, it's a question of how do you facilitate your mission objective as rapidly as possible, and and how do you ensure the success of that once you've implemented? And I've seen a lot of folks, as I say, go into this space and say, let's do it ourselves or let's get it done. And very often, it takes a lot longer than they've anticipated, which pushes out adoption, it pushes out return on investment. And that can be a very dangerous thing for the entire endeavor, particularly if we're talking a cloud application that's, reporting metrics to the street like number of users or number of transactions that occurred. But the other piece I would say two pieces I would say that are critical as well, which are often overlooked, would be, the user adoption and the acceptance really depends on the quality. And doing it right is hard enough. Doing it right and delivering the quality that your users demand to really embrace the service and make it part of whatever business objective you have, or to accept the user experience you're facilitating in a transaction, that has to be right. And, why would you risk the endeavor, to get the quality right, absolutely right the first time, if survival depends on it? A much more prudent path is to say, well, let's rely on an expert, let's get it done. And then when the business is mature and you know more about it, well, you can sure unbundle some of that and look at high volume countries and say, how do we back that out and do that a little differently? And we work with users and customers all the time on how they do that as the business becomes more mature. And then the last piece I would say, which is, I guess, the flip side of regulatory or another dimension to that whole question, would be, it becomes increasingly difficult with consumer protection to get everything right locally, and looking at how your traffic is routed and user information is stored. Those regulations really have ratcheted up in complexity, and with good reason, because there's a lot of things out there that governments are trying to protect consumers from and make sure that privacy and security are there. So again, having someone who does this for a living is a huge benefit. And very often we have a very unique vantage point, which an enterprise or an application service provider would not have, and that is scale. And the scale allows us to interact with governments and regulators on how regulations will be applied. It also allows us to look at things in the big picture. So if you think about something like fraudulent usage, we operate on a global scale, and we apply artificial intelligence to managing fraudulent usage patterns and identifying them before they become a major financial burden. And via APIs, our customers are able to, determine what level of threat protection they want to implement, like how sensitive they would like the protections and the filters to be, and what reaction they would like. Would they like to halt all traffic the minute fraud is detected? Would they like to throttle the traffic? Would they like to be alerted and decide what to do after the fraud has been detected? All of these things are things that can be configured via API or via a portal in the case of Tata Communications. But that's possible because we have the vantage point of global traffic volumes, which allows us to apply artificial intelligence to the patterns that we see and identify where fraud is happening and what is, quote unquote, normal usage for an organization based on machine learning of course, anonymized data, but understanding, where organizations call and the time of day that they call, so that when something happening over the weekend and someone's ratcheting up traffic to a destination that the organization never calls, obviously we can identify that more quickly. Those are things that are simply impossible for an enterprise or for an application provider to do. But as I say, they're becoming increasingly important in today's world, because you can't bear the burden of those kind of fraudulent usage or those kind of threats, or there's no way to get around the fact that governments are ratcheting up regulation. So you really need to find a way to embrace that and to deal with it effectively. And once again, I would say doing that with a global provider like Tata Communications is the way to go, simply by virtue of the fact that we have a vantage point which is unique in the industry.
Well, I have to say that fraud management service is definitely a very critical part of doing something like this on a global basis. And clearly, through my coverage of working with enterprises, it's always been somewhat of an issue, because they normally didn't have the sophistication or the tool set, including systems, to kind of make sure that didn't happen and it was managed properly. So that definitely is a good value add to the service. And I have to say, from this discussion, you've convinced me that the voice business is not dead, and that Tata Communications has made some major investments to create this new global offer for the demand that you see. And I just want to thank you very much for this discussion.
Well, thank you, Mike. I really appreciate it, and look forward to talking to you again soon.